Tariffs and Ukraine. US President Donald Trump is set to implement his latest wave of tariffs or reciprocal tariffs on the world, and his administration had been holding talks with Russia and Ukraine, respectively, in Saudi Arabia. What are the implications of these developments for the world, especially the global south? Welcome to a special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. And my guest today is Vijay Prashad, Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. President Trump is wielding the tariff stick to the whole world. Since US President Donald Trump returned to the White House, he has repeatedly threatened tariffs on friend and foe alike. The US President claims it is tit for tat. What they charge us, we charge them. Beyond China, Trump has announced tariffs on imports from its two neighbors, Canada and Mexico, and on economies in Europe and Asia. If implemented, this would be his most aggressive tariff actions to date, which could hike prices for consumers, damage supply chains, and potentially even spark a global trade war. What does the upcoming April 2nd tariff day mean when reciprocal tariffs are set to kick in? Who will be hit the hardest, and what are the impacts on developing countries in the global south? My guest today for an exclusive conversation is Professor Vijay. Welcome to The Point.
Yes, thanks a lot.
And welcome to the studio here. So let's talk about it, the timeline. We're not too far away from the so-called tariff day. Actually, on February the 12th, Trump announced a fair and reciprocal plan for trade. On March the 4th, Trump said in his speech to Congress that on April 2nd, reciprocal tariffs kick in, and whatever they tariff us, we will tariff them. And then on March the 19th, Trump is said to be intending for reciprocal tariffs to be kicking on this day. But he said on just a couple of days later, on March the 22nd, that there will be flexibilities on reciprocal tariffs. Help us understand, what exactly do you think he means by reciprocal tariffs?
Well, the first thing to understand is Mr. Trump is a businessman, a deal maker. He always sets maximal demands out in public first and then says, well, there's room to negotiate. This is what he did with Mexico. He aggressively went out there and said, these are the 10 things we want to do. When Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum said, look, we want to talk to you, they backed off. And they had a conversation and they came up with an agreement. The most important thing to understand with these tariffs is that they're not really going to work. The reason Mr. Trump has decided to do wholesale tariffs is he's worried that the United States over the last 50 years has deindustrialized, has cut its manufacturing, has come to rely on the global supply chain and so on, and he wants to rebuild American manufacturing. Tariffs are useful as a tool sometimes because they raise the cost of importing goods and therefore give an advantage to domestic manufacturers who can take advantage of the gap between the cost of a good and the tariff and flood the market with their goods. The problem is, you can do tariffs, that's fine, but who is going to invest in the United States to build the things that now you have a tariff wall against? Who's going to invest in building phones, for instance, inside the United States? Apple builds its phones largely in China. If you have a tariff against the import of Apple phones, the iPhone, who's going to build the iPhone factories inside the United States? There simply isn't the kind of public investment, government investment available for that, and billionaires haven't shown the appetite to tie their money up into manufacturing inside the United States. So tariffs sounds great in the abstract. Absent the availability of investment to rebuild manufacturing, it's a good luck scenario.
And he's talking about reciprocal tariffs, which sounds fair. I mean, what they charge us, we charge them. But on an economic merit base, is that how things work?
I mean, the idea of reciprocal tariffs is really a political statement to his own people, saying that the United States is being cheated by Mexico, cheated by Canada. We don't want to be cheated by them. We want fair trade. This is just ideological. This is what appeals to his base within the United States. In fact, there really aren't tariffs by other countries against the United States. Most countries are largely exporting to the United States. They are not preventing US goods to enter, because what kind of US goods are we talking about? Let's take the iPhone again. The iPhone is so much more expensive than phones manufactured in other countries that even if they came in with a subsidy, they couldn't be afforded by, say, customers in Zambia or customers in Bangladesh. They are priced out because Apple just charges way too much for them. The issue that is there before the world is that most of the world, including China, has actually moved away from reliance on the US market since the financial crisis of 2007. I mean, the reason why China developed a Belt and Road, or the reason why the BRICS project was created, was to increase trade amongst southern countries, so that trade between, say, China, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, and so on would increase. So you wouldn't rely on the US market. And I think Mr. Trump is living in a world where everybody is exporting goods into the United States. It's not true. Most Chinese goods are not going to the US.
And it would be, I would say, if you are exporting exactly the same thing, you know, for instance, I'm selling to you computers and you are selling to me computers, then how much I charge you, it would be fair to say how much you charge me. But countries are exporting different things, right? And the developmental levels are different. How can you have this kind of absolute equality, absolute reciprocity? But he seems to be able to sell these concepts, these narratives very easily. What's wrong with that? What's the problem here?
I mean, it would be absurd for countries to sell each other the same goods. Okay, that's contrary to the whole idea of trade. Why should I give you a computer and you give me a computer back? Makes no sense. If we want to talk about reciprocity in trade and unfairness in trade, we should put on the table the weapons industry. I mean, the United States saturates the world with weapons. It is the world's largest exporter of weapons to countries around the world. Mm-hmm. It's a way to effectively recycle some of the trade deficit that the US has and so on. Let's put that on the table. Let's see how fair that is. You know, the United States goes to countries and basically strong arms them to buying weapons from US arms manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and so on. That's never on the discussion when we talk about trade. That's sort of kept in a separate envelope called security.
So when you have partial fairness, you're not being fair, actually.
I mean, there is no fairness in trade, you know, just to be quite clear. Because, I mean, as you said, there are different countries, different levels of development. A country is an exporter of soybeans. Another country is an exporter of electronic goods. There is no fairness in trade. What you require is international procedures, international understanding, that you don't want a country that's an exporter of copper or raw nickel like Indonesia to continue to export raw nickel. Indonesia has taken the position that they banned the export of raw nickel. They say we must industrialize, process the nickel, and then export it outward. A country like China, which imports a lot of raw materials from Africa, has made a commitment to help industrialize African countries. Rather than raw cobalt leaving the Congo, let the cobalt be processed in the Congo. Some of the gain from trade must remain in the Congo. This is a discussion that's been happening between, say, China and African countries. There is no fairness in trade. There is fairness in the relations between countries.
So by using these simplistic approaches, he has basically managed to set the agenda and manipulate, you know, the discussion. Let's not be swayed by that. But is he going to start really a trade war with the with every country in the world and say you charge me. I mean, that's going to create a huge uncertainty for businesses. It's unimaginable, and yet he's talking about it. His team is proud of it. What's going on here? I mean, is there an ounce of sanity left in that administration?
Well, it's a good question to ask, and it's not just that administration. This is important. Look, the latest figures from the United States show that growth rates are just above 2%, but inflation rate is well above 3%. That means that inflation, rise in prices, is eating up growth. If you look at inflation and growth rates, you have negative growth effectively in the United States. So that's the situation now. If you put high tariffs on imported goods, your prices are going to go up. That's inevitable in the short term. There is no way, from April the 4th or 5th, you're going to start manufacturing in the US. This takes a very long time. That means people are going to suffer from high prices, and that's going to create a political problem. This political problem is intractable. There's no way to get around it. Mr. Trump has boxed himself into the tariffs. I don't know if he can retreat from all of them. I think that's impossible.
At the same time, he's talking about flexibility, unabashedly. I mean, who is going to take him and his team seriously from now on?
I mean, but the thing is, again, let's look at the last several administrations in the United States. I would hesitate before I have confidence in a US government's promises about anything. I mean, even if you look back at Mr. Biden talked about that the United States must build chip manufacturing. So they went to Taiwan and said, let's move chip manufacturing to Arizona. Well, they invested money, built a factory. It's gone nowhere. They didn't plan this properly. I mean, part of it is long-term planning has disappeared in a number of Western countries. They are not planning in the long term. Just talking about tariffs and throwing tariffs on the table without a long-term plan creates insecurity. I don't know what the plan is.
Yeah. It's good for campaign, though. I mean, it's a very good slogan, and people can get very excited about it. And the next day, they probably forgot about what's being said, and they probably won't notice the extra cents and dollars here they pay here and there. But what are going to be the implications for developing countries, for countries in South America, for instance, who have so far not been the direct target of his tariff stakes?
Well, the thing is that most of these countries have already started to pivot their trade away from reliance on the markets in not only the United States but also Europe. It used to be that for most of the world, including China, the market of last resort was the United States. You can produce things, you sell it all over the world. If you can't find buyers in other places, just go and dump it in the US. They'll buy it eventually. They'll borrow money, they'll buy it. That's how the world saw the world market. The United States was the buyer of last resort. With the financial crisis of 2007, there was, I think, some clarity. At the time, Raghuram Rajan was the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund. And he said that China and the United States are in a satanic embrace. Very strong phrase. That China was lending money to US consumers to buy Chinese goods, and this was a vicious circle. Well, after the world financial crisis of 2007, countries in the developing world began to reassess reliance on the markets in the United States and in Europe, and they are now trading much more with each other, amongst each other.
Yeah.
So their reliance on the US is much less than it was before.
What can these countries do to mitigate the uncertainty that's being created?
But they're going to have to trade more with each other. That's what they're going to have to do. The loser in this is going to be the United States. There are 7 billion people in the world. There are only 300 million in the US. There are consumers all over the world. Reliance on the United States at this point, not a good thing for countries in the global south.
Vijay Prashad, director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. We'll take a short break, and when we come back, we'll talk about the ongoing negotiations to end the military conflict in Ukraine. Stay with us. Welcome back. U.S. talks with Russia and Ukraine appear to be gaining momentum. On March the 24th, Russia and Ukraine are set to hold separate talks with U.S. officials in Saudi Arabia. Since taking office in January, Donald Trump has engaged directly with both sides. He had 2 phone calls with Russian President Vladimir Putin, one in February, one in March, and he has met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in February, followed by a phone call the day after speaking with his Russian counterpart. While diplomatic efforts intensify, Russia and Ukraine forces are still engaged in intense fighting on the ground. How close are all sides to achieving peace? What stands in the way? Can a ceasefire be reached soon? I'll continue my exclusive conversation with Vijay Prashad, Director of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. Vijay, let's talk about these negotiations. How do you look at, it seems that the US brokered efforts, indirect negotiations between Ukraine and Russia seem to be gaining momentum. How do you look at it?
I mean, one of the things to understand is that this war should never have happened. It was absolutely unnecessary. And when it started in February 2022, it could have ended within a month. Within a month, the Ukrainians and the Russians were having discussions in Belarus. They were having discussions in Turkey. Mm-hmm. They were making great progress. And then something stopped the peace talks.
Right.
And that something is what has actually caused the war. That something which stopped the peace talks was the intervention of the Europeans and the United States. When Boris Johnson goes to Kiev, goes for a walk about the city of Kiev with Volodymyr Zelensky, he basically tells Mr. Zelensky, the United States, the Europeans, the British, everybody's right behind you.
Are you saying the Europeans are the stumbling blocks in the way?
I think the Europeans and the United States from 2022 onward.
Now Trump?
Yes, what Trump has done is, because he's withdrawn US support for Ukraine to continue the war, this has actually put the Europeans, it has in fact shown the Europeans for being how weak they are. When Keir Starmer of Britain makes a statement saying that if Vladimir Putin doesn't accept the ceasefire, there will be consequences. Well, Mr. Starmer, what consequences? Britain has no ability to inflict consequences on Russia. France has no ability to inflict consequences, nor has Germany. None of these countries have the military ability to inflict consequences on Russia, only the United States. It was the United States that egged on this conflict from at least 2014, if not when the Soviet Union collapsed, when the United States felt, well, now we control all of Europe, and pushed forward the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. It's interesting, just to make this point, that as the European Union expanded, NATO expanded. It's almost as if the United States didn't want to permit Europe to expand without US influence. And the expansion of NATO closer and closer to the Russian border initially was not seen as a problem by Boris Yeltsin. But Mr. Putin understood that this is a serious problem for Russia, and that provoked the conflict.
And now the US is playing the role of a peacemaker.
I'm not sure if I would use the word peacemaker. At least they want to end this conflict. I think Mr. Trump has made a break from about 40 years of US idealism. In US foreign policy, there are 2 branches. There's the idealists and the realists. The idealists controlled foreign policy from Bill Clinton onward. The idealists believed that you could use US power, military power, sanctions, bullying, force, etc., to make the world in the US image. That was the idealist gambit.
Shining city on the hill.
Shining city on the hill, globalization, we'll just tell people what to do, we'll go and get rid of the government in Iraq, we'll build a free market society, and so on. Mr. Trump has returned to some influence realists. These are Henry Kissinger type right-wing realists, people like Elbridge Colby, the grandson of William Colby, head of the CIA. He runs the China policy in the Trump administration. There are people like that who are realists. The realists say, look, Ukraine cannot defeat Russia. Russia is a nuclear power. Ukraine has to live in the neighborhood of Russia. This is not a winnable war.
So as Europe.
So does Europe, and you can't weaken Russia. The claim made by Lloyd Austin, the former defense secretary in the administration of Joe Biden, he said in Kiev, the aim of this was to weaken Russia. How are you going to weaken Russia? Russia is an enormous country. It has a nuclear arsenal. You can't weaken Russia. Mr. Putin is pretty popular in the country. This is not a feasible or realistic outcome. Mr. Trump has understood that. This is not a winnable war. So if you can't win a war, you've got to sue for peace and end it. And I think he is coming into this from a realistic standpoint, not as a peacemaker. The statement he made to Mr. Zelensky is interesting, where he said, what do you want? Do you want World War III? I think that's a pretty straightforward statement, that this, if it persists, can actually lead to something catastrophic, and they don't want a catastrophe.
They don't want to be seen as brokering the peace, let's put it this way. The US did pressure Ukraine to sign a minerals deal. What's going to be the implication? I mean, for me, watching from a distance, this is very ugly, honestly. You know, you're basically taking advantage of a very small country and say, look, you've got to give me something if you want me to do something for you. What do you see? How do you see the situation?
This has been the situation with the United States for the last 80 years. You know, if a small country doesn't behave properly, the leader gets couped. This happened in Guatemala, it happened in Iran, it happened in so many countries. You know, in Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh said, we want to nationalize and control our oil. The United States and Britain got rid of him. This attitude to small countries is not new. If you don't give us what we want, you are going to go. We've seen this a long time before. Actually, underneath this deal in Ukraine is something fundamental. Right now, most companies around the world rely on China for 95% of rare earth minerals. 95%. The United States is interested in breaking away from that reliance on China. This is the reason why Mr. Trump is, shaking down in a mafia way the Ukrainian government.
Also Greenland.
Yeah, and Greenland, exactly. And Greenland, saying, look, we want Greenland because there are rare earth minerals there. This is what's going on behind the scenes in a way. Why I say that Mr. Trump is not a peacemaker, and I want to say this to you in a cautionary way, is that they are not interested in peace in the world. They are interested in backing away from an unwinnable conflict in order to pursue a conflict which they think they have to win. And that is the conflict against China. They think the economic war against China is the war they have to win. Mr. Colby is realistic enough, and in his writings, he's the main advisor to Trump on China. In his writings, he has said that China's development, its advance in telecommunications, in robotics, high-speed rail, etc., is a challenge to the US economy, to US high-tech corporations, which are the engine of the US economy. And that is where they want to put their focus, not on an unwinnable war in Ukraine.
So along with what you are saying now, basically President Trump, in an interview with Fox News, he has just said he learned from history. I don't know how much he learns from history, but he seems he does learn from history that you cannot put China and Russia together. So by trying to end the war, in this way, by trying to broker the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia separately, is Trump putting what he learned in history into practice?
I mean, I would say very bluntly that I feel like Mr. Trump wants to do the reverse of what Henry Kissinger had tried to do in the 1970s. The greatest problem for the West would be if the large countries in Asia come together. And that's what was happening in the 1950s. China and Russia had come together, the Soviet Union and the new People's Republic of China. India, Indonesia, China at the Bandung conference 70 years ago this year had come together. This new grouping had to be broken. And indeed, the United States tried their best to break that grouping. Well, with the 30-year, 40-year attempt to squeeze both Russia and China, it has brought Russia and China together. Russia and China signed a no-limits partnership in 2022. I think Mr. Trump recognizes, which Mr. Biden and others didn't recognize, that it's important to separate these countries from each other. And I think that's very much on their mind, to somehow bring Russia on side with the West again and try to squeeze China. I would be very cautious about what's happening. Now, the thing is, I also think this is a foolish attempt, because I don't think the Russians are prepared at this point to abandon the no limits partnership, because they have seen how fickle the West is as being an ally. And how the West has treated Russia, humiliated Russia ever since the fall of the Soviet Union. I think the West is overestimating their ability to bring Russia on side. So I think that might be their agenda, but I don't think it's going to be easy.
Well, everybody is using their brain. Everybody is watching. We're informing ourselves. It's unbelievable how some people think they can manipulate things and that people wouldn't see through it. I mean, at this stage, at least a lot of people here in China see exactly what's going to happen, and I doubt that we're going to let it happen that way. But 3 years on after the Ukraine conflict broke out, have there been winners, if any? Have there been losers? What's the biggest lesson to take away for countries such as Ukraine?
Well, first, if I was a country like Ukraine, small country, limited military capacity, I would try my best to get along with my neighbors. I think it's a bad idea to try to provoke a war, even if you feel like you have external forces backing you. Because, the Europeans and the United States were willing to sit back and watch the Ukrainians die for a war that was not going to benefit Ukraine.
Ukrainian people would say they are not they did not provoke it. They would say they are the ones that have been victimized. They are the victim here.
Right, but on the other hand, you can enumerate the things that were provocations. I mean, was it necessary for the Ukrainian parliament to ban the use of Russian? Was it necessary to bring back Stephen Bandera, a fascist from the 1940s, and extol his virtues? Was it necessary to allow gangs of neo-Nazis to go into eastern Ukraine and terrorize the Russian population? Was it necessary to shut down water supplies to Crimea? I mean, you can enumerate a number of provocations which are unnecessary. Equally, I think it is worthwhile remembering that Mr. Zelensky won an election with a promise to make peace with Russia. It would have been valuable to have backed off from these provocations against the Russian-speaking people of Ukraine and opened a dialogue with Moscow. But that didn't happen. Instead, Ukraine looked westward, and the West saw an opportunity to keep pushing against Russia. I mean, when Mr. Trump in 2019 withdrew the United States unilaterally from the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty, the INF Treaty, this is very significant. And by the way, the withdrawal unilateral by the US from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Treaty, has implications for China because now there's no treaty obligation for the US not to place intermediate nuclear missiles in countries that neighbor China. This is very, very dangerous. And the United States needs to come back to the table, negotiate a treaty which does not allow the placement of so-called battlefield nuclear weapons in countries next to each other. I think this is very dangerous, very provocative, and it's not the gesture of a peacemaker.
We have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Vijay Prashad, for sharing with us your valuable insights. It's too short, but we hope to bring you back the next time. Vijay Prashad, Director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.